Hello, everybody. I'm Carol Willis, and I put together the semester series with all my good friends, historians and architects and engineers who have long studied the skyscraper and who have collaborated with the museum over the years on ideas about how to tell skyscraper history. This particular lecture series, called, as you see in our slide, Rewriting Skyscraper History, Looking Back from the 21st Century, was precipitated by a symposium that was held last year that I'll talk about in a minute from the slides. But many of the people who have generously donated their time for lectures over the past fall were involved in that project, and we were all equally uncomfortable with some of the questions that were posed and ultimately became the formulating questions for the symposium that was called First Skyscrapers, Skyscraper Firsts. So what I suggest for this kind of summary session that looks back on the 10 or so lectures that we already have under our belts and the various participants and the questions that we've posed is to think in a kind of summary way of what we've heard and to go back to that kind of instigating question about what was the first skyscraper and ask, aren't there better questions? Indeed, isn't there a better definition for skyscraper? That should be our operating principle as we move forward with rewriting skyscraper history from the perspective of the 21st century, looking backward. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that overview and those thoughts today with a series of slides that react to and then propose some ideas for thinking about skyscraper history. So this was a symposium that was organized by and the considerable efforts of the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, and was held in Chicago in 2019. And here was the phrase that was the question that brought together a whole group of scholars, and a publication indeed has just resulted from that effort that I'll talk about towards the end of this talk. Because the steering committee for formulating the symposium included many of the speakers in our series from this fall, and you can see some of them here in a slide that I showed before in the series. I call these my co-conspirators. We are in an amusing way on Halloween afternoon at the end of the conference, trying to kill the urban myth, the zombie of the home insurance building. And indeed, that's a name I dare not speak further, I think, except maybe one or two times in the rest of this session, because I think that the more we address the issue of trying to disprove the home insurance building as the first skyscraper, the more we get sidetracked into arguments which aren't very productive. And so let me go to that question, what was the first skyscraper? And remind people that this question assumes that we agree on a definition of skyscraper, which is a definition that I hope to revisit towards the end of this talk. If we look at some of the established bodies, for example, the Getty Center on the Art and Architecture Thesaurus that you can see a screenshot of here, you see about in the middle a note of the definition of skyscraper, which they treat as an exceptionally tall building of skeletal frame construction. So, skeletal frame construction. Yes, this is the kind of defining technology that is usually associated with the skyscraper. Indeed, through much of the 20th century, which is the century of steel, steel is the material of construction for most skyscrapers, let's say most business skyscrapers, most office buildings. And we see two classic views of the skeleton frame and on the right, the Tacoma building in Chicago on the left, that establishes this narrative of modernism that sees the expression of the steel frame covered in a curtain wall or a wall hanging on the interior skeleton of glass construction, emphasizing a skin of glass that has a kind of lineage that triumphantly emerges in the post-war period in the US in a building like Mies van der Rohe's Seagram building. Framing, literally framing, of the skyscraper as a skeleton construction becomes the kind of operating definition of skyscraper, as you saw in the Getty Thesaurus, and is the way that in the modernist narrative, we've always talked about the skyscraper. Indeed, even when the structural system isn't really a skeleton construction, isn't a perfect description of many of the skyscrapers that were built in the 20th century. For example, you see under construction the World Trade Center with its tube construction, where the exterior wall are load-bearing columns, and they are carrying to the interior core of steel the weight of the floors and the openness of floors that contradict the regular grid of skeletal construction that we think of as emerging in the first half of the 20th century. And you see in the plan how that central core and the exterior supporting wall of the tube construction in the plan of the World Trade Center tower allows for these open floors, which is also a part of the modernist narrative, that expansive open space. When we think about the skyscraper then as an office building built of steel, we see that the evolution of the typology, which is demonstrated here in a graphic that was created by the Skyscraper Museum back in 1998. So when the World Trade Center indeed still stood. And it's been slightly adapted to our new website. And it, of course, has added the towers of Asia. Petronas Towers was already on the original chart, but the Taipei 101 of 2004, and then of course completed in 2010, the Burj Khalifa. The only building on this kind of rise of the skyscraper charted, the only building that's a residential building rather than an office building. So if we think of the definition of the skyscraper, as it was so neatly summarized by the structural engineer Bill Baker of SOM, who indeed is the structural engineer for the Burj Khalifa, he said that if skyscraper history stopped in let's say 1974 and even in 1996, the definition of a skyscraper would be an office building constructed of steel in North America. And that's what we see in this chart, up through the Sears Tower, Sears now Willis Tower, until the title of the world's tallest building moves to Asia, and then to the Mideast. So with the Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur, the Taipei 101 in Taiwan, and the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. But all of the previous buildings, and what this chart shows is the buildings that replaced the earlier one by becoming the title holder for the world's tallest buildings. So the emphasis in this chart is on another of these very frequent preoccupations of skyscraper historians or people who write about skyscrapers, and that is, what is the tallest building? Now, the tallest building in the world now, and perhaps for many more years, depending on the completion of the one that we'll see in a moment. The one that's tallest now, of course, is the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. And it is characterized by its sleek curtain wall and an all-glass tower is pretty much the prevailing characteristic of 21st century towers that you see, for example, by a number of different architects, but all located in the precinct of Hudson Yards here in Manhattan, begun construction around 2010 and still being completed. So the floor to ceiling vision glass, the curtain wall of these pristine forms is something that seems to be characteristic of the most recent skyscrapers. It is characteristic, but what's underneath that glass, it almost uniformly is no longer a skeleton of steel, but rather a structural system that's built of concrete. And here we see the Burj Khalifa under construction in Dubai. And here you see the building that could become, by its design values and its ascending height, the world's tallest building by a couple hundred meters more. This is the beginning of the construction, and so far the halted height of the Jeddah Tower in Saudi Arabia. And you see it here under construction going up to a little bit less than 200 meters, but close up so that you can see what the building is made of, concrete, and you see the core, you see the system of construction, and we're reminded in the definition of Bill Baker of the 21st century skyscraper that the characteristics of the super tall in the current century is that it is built of concrete. It is usually a mixed use structure or residential, as this one is, both principally residential and also mixed use, and in either China or in the Middle East. So the geography has changed, the structural system has changed, and the use has changed as well. So I'm suggesting that as we look at the skyscraper from the 21st century backward, that we pay attention to these issues of location, which has changed, of course, with the globalization, but especially of materials. And I note in the words of the structural engineer who is the designer for the Jeddah Tower, Bob Sin, that he emphasizes that the structural system here is extremely simple. It's a load-bearing wall. A load-bearing wall, not a skeleton, not a point support system, but a masonry system, essentially, a load-bearing wall. We see it in the plans of the Burj Khalifa on the lower right, of the Jeddah Tower on the left, and above two towers with somewhat different structural systems, the Guiyang International Finance Center on the left, and the Beijing Civic Tower on the right, where you can see the central core of concrete in all of the buildings, whether it's a triangle or a square, how substantial, indeed rigidly substantial, this structure of concrete is, because it's what carries the weight of the building, not a frame. So, can we ask some better questions given this 21st century reality of the evolution of the typology of the skyscraper that reflect back on the 20th century and indeed the focus of our series, which is the last quarter of the 19th century. So what are these better questions is what I want to explore in the rest of this talk. We already asked, what is the first skyscraper? But it's not a great question. It has a standard answer that, as I promise not to mention the name of the building again, but quietly, the Home Insurance Building in Chicago of 1883-84 is cited in many an internet resource as the first skyscraper. And that is because of the incorrect, but nevertheless constantly repeated characteristic of the building as being a rigid metal skeleton, which in fact it was not, as we know definitively from Jerry Larson's talk. The home insurance building as a steel skeleton technology is one of the characteristics. The steel skeleton technology is one of the characteristics of the skyscraper. And the other one, of course, in the enabling technology that allows buildings to become tall, that allows developers to exploit the value of the land in multi-story buildings, of course, is the elevator. So we see, again, as we know from Lee Gray, an apocryphal image of the demonstration of the safety mechanism by Elijah Otis, who did indeed have a display at the Crystal Palace exhibition in New York in 1853, 54, when he demonstrated the cut cable that allowed him to demonstrate his safety mechanism and how it worked, and to allegedly claim to the crowd, if there was a crowd there, all safe gentlemen. So if we put together the elevator, a safe passenger elevator, and the steel cage construction, we have these two technologies that enabled the century of steel of the skyscraper, and that often gives a definition, a simple definition to skyscraper history. But these two images, even if they were of their exact moment of happening, are separated by 20 years. 1854, they're separated by 30 years, 1854 and 1884. So one of the kind of guiding principles of the narrative of the skyscraper has been technological determinism in much of the scholarly writing. So if we have to ask if technology so determines the progress and the pace of the adoption of technology in order to create ever taller buildings, why did it take 20 years between the safety mechanism that Otis demonstrated, why did it take 30 years between the safety mechanism that Otis demonstrated and what we call, some people have called the first skyscraper? And that is a history that Lee Gray explored in a long lecture that I would point you to in the first week of our programming. So a better question than what was the first skyscraper, since we reject the home insurance building and we can argue about when and what building either used the first technology of iron framing, as Jerry Larson offered us specific examples in a talk 2 weeks ago, or if we argue for a definition of skyscraper that emphasizes tall and looks to the 1870s to New York buildings, which were built of masonry, of bearing wall construction. We can find an argument for the debate between the birthplace of the skyscraper being in New York and Chicago. But a better question to ask than what was the first was when was the first? And of course, it has to be a plural. When were the first skyscrapers? My answer for that is in New York in the 1870s. And you see definitively taller than the surrounding structures. The building on the right of this etching, which is the New York Tribune building, which was completed in 1874. And we see it in another view next to City Hall Park, where it has been far surpassed by additional towers. To its left, the World building of Joseph Pulitzer, which was completed in 1890 to become the world's tallest building, and a series of other towers that are even taller than that you see along Printers Row. So the decade of the initial exploitation of the elevator in order to create tall buildings that multiplied the value of the land, that proclaimed the status of a newspaper like the New York Tribune, to the world on the skyline to attract attention, to gain status, those conditions that produced the tall building were present in the mid 1870s in New York, 10 years before the unmentionable Chicago Tower with its not complete metal skeleton. Another of the buildings that is contemporaneous with the home insurance building is the Western Union building that you see dominating this exaggerated width of Broadway looking south towards Trinity Church, which indeed rose in its steeple just a tad taller than the 230-foot Western Union building pinnacle. And there we see another one of the large companies that wanted both a position, a location on Broadway, but was also, as we know from the ideas explored in Kate Holliday's talk about the telephone buildings, that the technology of telegraph of Western Union and then of telephone of AT&T and the Bell telephone systems were tethered to place by wires, whether it was the wire for the telegraph or the copper wires that literally connected the telephones in building offices and under the streets into the telephone switching buildings. These were the urban condition that required proximity for business in order for business to be efficient. So that the urban situation is one of the characteristics that produces these tall buildings, both in the needs of the businesses to locate and also for them to multiply the value of their land or the value of the rents on that piece of land in multi-story buildings. And we can see that in a timeline that was put together by the Skyscraper Museum for an exhibition that was called 10 and Taller, based on the research, the more than decade-long research by Donald Friedman, one of our speakers, who was interested in getting a complete data set, not just of New York, which is what you see here, but Chicago and every other city in the United States who had a building that was 10 stories or taller in the years from the 1870s to 1900, when 10-story buildings became so ubiquitous that Dunn just stopped counting them. And if we look at this graph that was produced from Don's data by the museum, we wanted to visualize his considerable efforts in data collection that produced an extremely impressive Excel sheet, but not the kind of visual information that we wanted to use to explore the ideas of urbanism rather than the facts of structural materials and structural systems, which was the point of Don's study. So what we see in this timeline that goes from 1874-5 with the New York Tribune building and then the Western Union building are all the buildings in New York that were 10 stories or taller, represented by their height on this kind of bar graph that registers the height. And on our website, you can click on one of the bars and learn which building this is, how tall it is. See, it's Department of Buildings statistics sheet. You can see photographs of the building as well. On this timeline, you can see the simultaneous representation of all of these buildings and their multiplication through the last decades of the 19th century. You can see that in 1874-75, there were 2 and 3 buildings only that were 10 stories. You can see that by the 1880s, mid and early 1880s, about the time that Chicago was beginning to develop its wealth and its abundance of tall buildings, that New York then is suffering the repercussions of the Great Panic of 1873 and that long recession, has a limited amount of tall building, and that the ones in blue that are represented in blue, which are apartment buildings, begin to predominate. So two things are already apparent in the timeline, that uses are not exclusively office buildings, but in other kinds of what I'll call commercial architecture, where these apartment buildings, most of these early ones were actually built in a cooperative system. So people would have bought their apartments rather than simply rented them. But these are developed usually by a single person or a small syndicate, for the sale, for development for sale to individuals. In order, the building is commercial because it's constructed to make money for the person who is developing it. So we see then through the 1880s into about 1890, when all of a sudden there is a multiplication of the number of office buildings and a kind of exceptional striving for height that you can see in the lines that poke up above the others. And just to briefly mention the other characteristics of the timeline, the dark blue that you see represented are hotels. So hotels that Andrew Sandoval Strauss talked about in one of the lectures in our series are quite tall compared to the preponderance of the office buildings that you can see in the early 1890s, and are represented through the rest of the decade as a significant portion of the tall buildings. But then there's another color added, and while the orange buildings are not the tallest of the group, and they are fairly uniformly around 150 feet tall, those buildings begin to dominate, in fact, in some of the late 1890s. And those buildings are loft buildings. Lofts that are essentially generic space used for usually manufacturing, kind of light manufacturing. And as Andrew Dolkart detailed in his talk about the lofts, not of the garment district, but especially along Broadway, and their origins in the garment industry in New York, you can see how important the speculative form of construction of loft buildings, where the buildings are constructed to rent out floor by floor or portions of floors for rent over time by oftentimes a small developer, could be from an estate, but entrepreneurs, speculators, and men who would advance their fortunes through real estate in New York, often began by building these generic loft buildings. So another of the themes, as I've already suggested, that I think is a bit of a red herring because it so dominates the discussion in the popular imagination about the history of the skyscraper, is focusing just on this issue of the world's tallest building. And certainly the imagery of skyscrapers through its history demonstrates very clearly that the people who built the tallest buildings were after status, were after their primacy, and used that status, as Gail Fensky showed us in her talk on business buildings and on corporate images. In that lecture, she talked especially about buildings like the Singer Building that you see dominating the peak of the pyramid as it became in 1908 the world's tallest building, and promoted its superiority through an image like this that compared it to the historical monuments, the great architecture of world history. And if we pursue that line of discussion, which we didn't really in the lecture series, because there were these other, I think, better questions we wanted to ask. If we pursue this idea of the what is the world's tallest building, then we have to ask and get involved in the debate about what it is that we measure. And that is a part of the debate that is historical, because you see from a reproduction of an illustration from 1905 in the New York Times, which was produced as a special edition to commemorate the opening of the Times Tower in Times Square, naming that important part of New York, both past and present and future, we hope, after the building that pioneered the tall building in Midtown. And you see the particular argument that the Times advanced in one of the images in their special supplement that treats the Times building as the tallest in New York, because they argued what was necessary to measure would include the foundations, which is where the building, after all, begins. So that line of multiple arguments about how to measure buildings is continued in the referee organization by the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, who keeps a very impressive database called the Skyscraper Center that I direct you all towards, to measure by 3 different criteria that you can see represented here in their graph, how to measure a building by its architectural height, the height to its tip, the height of the occupied floor. And when one looks at the lineup of buildings by these different criteria, you can see that the buildings dance around a little bit in their chorus line. So that our representation that I showed you before, the world's tallest buildings, is matched by a projection that CTBUH did back in, I think, 2012, of the buildings that would be the 20 tallest buildings in 2020. And though quite a number of these in the top 10 were not realized as planned, you can see both the importance of the idea of owning or of constructing or being the home to the tallest building in the world, represented in the ambition of this lineup. But you can also see how some buildings stretch through those additional legitimate measuring sticks, like the spire atop One World Trade Center in New York, or Taipei 101's little extra spire that pokes up above the somewhat shorter by absolute vertical height of the buildings to its right. So Taipei 101 at number 18 and Shanghai World Financial Center at 19, or ICC in Hong Kong at 20. You can see are more substantial buildings in their girth, in their volume, than some of the ones that are have a less high occupied floor, or indeed to the right of One World Trade Center, the residential building of Central Park Towers, which has not nearly the amount of floor space. So that idea of world's tallest is an idea that certainly cannot be erased from the public imagination, nor would we want it to be, because it has both inspired great buildings, and it has also inspired great pride in many people in many cities who feel like they have a kind of stake, a kind of personal ownership in the pride of primacy. But as the museum has tried to show, in the 21st century, if we take buildings and rearrange them not by their height, ascending height, or in 3 different charts of ascending height, but line them up instead by the area of the interior space that they enclose, which is represented in our graph here, you can see that buildings have not gotten bigger. They may have gotten taller, but they haven't gotten bigger than the World Trade Center towers in 1971 and 74, the Sears Tower in the World Trade Center in 1971 and 73, or the Sears Tower in 1974, you can see that few buildings, the one in between the two American towers in purple is Ping An in Shenzhen. And there, difficult to really make a clear measurement about the floor area or the gross building area, as it's often called in these towers, but it does seem to be marginally larger at 118 stories than the 110-story towers of the American 20th century examples. The point of this graph is to connect again to the idea of the skyscraper as commercial architecture, because from the perspective of the owners, as many as may desire to own and erect the world's tallest building, that's a high standard. We have many skyscrapers that do not compete in that race, and clearly in the minds and the balance sheets of the buildings from these owners, the amount of floor space that they offer for rent is their principal characteristic, not their height. So in our better questions, if we line up the classic journalists' 5 W's and an H, the who, what, when, where, why, how, we reposition those as what, where, in a kind of, and if we reposition those in a hierarchy of the questions that seem the most formative in thinking about skyscrapers, the what, of course, the where, the when that we already discussed, the why, which is fundamentally commercial, but maybe on an individual level, a much more complex story. The who and the how. The how is the easiest one of these questions to answer. The how is the structural systems. The how is the materials of construction. The how is the labor that constructs the buildings, the architects and the engineers that solve the problems of laying out a floor plan or of lateral loads. The how is something which is very describable, often individual to a project. So if we return then to just revisit for a moment the timeline of New York buildings, of the tallest buildings in New York, from 10 stories to 32 stories, the tallest building of the world that you see here in 1899, which was the Park Row building. If we think about those as buildings that are tall, we see the handful of those buildings which are truly exceptional, that compete on the skyline literally by poking up above the datum of the majority of the buildings. And if we look at the under half, the lower 50% of the timeline, we see not the tall, but the all of the skyscraper as it's constructed in New York in the last quarter of the 20th century. So from tall to all, we have quite a different story to recount if we are looking to explain the evolution, the location, the presence, and the multiplication of skyscrapers. And we did this with Don's data with images of the buildings as well. We put them on a grid so you could see every one of them, which is difficult to do. You can filter them by their use on our website through the grid. You can see some of them in the two typologies that Andrew Sandoval Strauss reviewed in his talk. The hotels on the left, the apartment buildings on the right, in some of their multiple examples. We see the loft buildings that Andrew Dolkart spoke about on Broadway in a couple of examples that you see here and that we saw in orange on our graph, as well as in orange on the map where we took Don's data and we located those buildings' footprints across Manhattan. On our website, you can track and add or subtract these footprints by year so that you can see the location of the buildings. And what you realize by manipulating the timeline that I won't do here, but is how the location of skyscrapers is not a march north, as it is often described, from lower Manhattan over on the left-hand side with that proliferation of red dots that you see downtown, to the area to the north where all of the footprints are either in dark blue or light blue, which means those are residential buildings. So there was, even in 1900, still a split between where the office buildings and where the commercial buildings of the lofts of speculative commercial construction was located, and that is pretty much south of 26th Street by 1900. You see it here in a kind of zoom in example. And you also see how the building addresses are attracted to the value corridor of Broadway, whether they're office buildings or lofts mixed together, or the green are institutional or department stores. But you can see how the location of Broadway gives value, apparently, to those buildings, because that's where the developers decided to build the tallest buildings. So that idea of the value of land is another one of the key characteristics of the skyscraper and skyscraper history that needs to be emphasized in my view. And this fantastic map of land values by Richard Hurd from 1903 in his book Principles of City Land Values of 1908 shows you in the round bubbles the value in Lower Manhattan per square foot. Only place in America at this point that land was valued by the square foot rather than by the frontage foot, as it was, for example, in Chicago. You see where the value is the highest around Broadway and Wall Street, indeed on the intersection of Broad and Wall Street, 1 block from Broadway, where $400 a square foot is the highest land value. And then lining the northward direction of Broadway, $350 a square foot, $250, $200, $150 as we get to City Hall Park, where also some value of land right by City Hall and on Newspaper Row is $200 a square foot. But then we also see that just a bare 3 blocks from those highest price values of land anywhere in America, and indeed probably in the world, the value of land drops off dramatically, precipitously, to $25 a square foot, and another block farther from Broadway, $10 a square foot. So here, the standard cliche of New York skyscraper development, that there was no room to build out, so people built up instead, is contradicted by the clear description of land values, that is the desire to build on that spot, to pay high prices, to pay high rents for location, indeed location, 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 the first 3 principles of real estate development. And you see that here as it plays out in the footprints from Don's data. and in the buildings on the crowding onto the Broadway corridor right at Wall Street and Trinity Church, with its spire in the foreground here, in about 1915, when the Equitable building is completed at 40 stories and precipitates the next phase of New York skyscraper construction. And one of the key characteristics then after 1916 is the constraints of municipal zoning laws, not building codes, but zoning laws over the bulk of buildings. So the skyline plays out in New York and in Chicago in different ways. As I illustrated in my book Form Follows Finance way back in 1995. And I haven't changed my opinion too much on this basic view that New York is a city of towers because it lacks the constraints of zoning and municipal regulation before 1916. And then of course, buildings become shaped in the next era by these new conditions. But New York is a laissez-faire town in all of the years through the early 20th century, when Chicago places a height limits on their construction after 1893. And you see that very clearly in some of the representations of the commercial buildings of the Chicago Loop that you see here, or speeding along to some specific examples of the buildings like Grand McNally, both outside and this interior court, that illustrate a fundamental difference between the two cities, which is the platting of the land, which creates lot sizes that require a different kind of planning in their office floor plans in order to illuminate the interior space. And in Chicago, and also because of the height caps, the buildings need to be penetrated by light courts in a way that they did not in New York, where the lots were much smaller. But more characteristic of Chicago is the standard formulation of the quarter block site penetrated by a light cord and capped in its height by the restrictions of Chicago's building code and height caps at varying heights over the decades, but 130 feet, 200 feet, and some in between, and in plan in the light court, and echoed in the square checkerboard of the platting of the land inside of the loop. So if we look at these two principal cities of skyscraper construction, and we see how different they are because of their urban conditions, because of the constraints that are placed on either height or lot size that constrain the kinds of designs that architects can formulate at a time when technology is fairly standardized and it allows for not too wide a range of experiment, but in this commercial architecture, a standard formula that also needs to serve the demands of the interior space, of light, of illuminating the office interior. So that what typifies a skyscraper in New York and in Chicago is different. The height issue in one city or another is limitless or limited. The context for both is urban. The use needs to be questioned in order to understand, and the structural system is, as Don Friedman showed us, somewhat variable within a range of the adoption of a kind of hybrid system of masonry and metal, and then ultimately the steel skeleton. So what typifies a skyscraper is by 1900, a building which is tall in a context that is urban, by use, what I would call commercial, rather than distinguishing between or differentiating even office buildings, hotels, residential buildings and lofts. And in the 19th century is essentially a hybrid system, or a metal or then steel skeleton frame, but which today is concrete or composite, as we discussed at the beginning. So the things that have changed about from the 19th century to the 21st century are the structural systems, but the context of urban hasn't really changed, I would argue. Even when solo towers rise in the middle of the desert, because their aspiration is to become the centerpiece of an urban complex that is, in some cases, yet to be built in Jeddah, but for the Burj Khalifa as the centerpiece of what is called downtown Dubai, a development which is distinguished from the old center in the central business district. That real estate strategy is an urban strategy that involves mixed use, residential, retail, and office. But throughout, the prevailing characteristic of these buildings, as I've argued, across types, is always commercial. That is, the buildings are businesses that are created by their builders in order to make money in rents and to make money in the sale of apartments, but they are essentially a commercial architecture. So the typology of the skyscraper, I would argue, has little to do with a determinative structural system, but everything to do with these conditions I've just outlined, that they are tall buildings in an urban context, and they are all fundamentally commercial architecture. So I look forward to hearing more from our various speakers about their thoughts from their own work, and how this definition might apply or perhaps be contradicted from some of their experiences. But I would hope that we could turn from what, and if it sounds perhaps a bit glib, what is often called critical studies in academia, where you take a master's in critical studies. And I would say, let's talk more about constructive studies, where we spend our time not trying to prove wrong other scholars or other eras' definitions about what constitutes the skyscraper in the past, or what forms the beginning of a lineage in which we experience in our present and then look back. But let's think about a constructive studies where we do try to formulate what are the characteristics of the tall building that transcend times, that existed in the 19th century origins and still exist today, and to have that inform our studies and help us ask better questions. Thanks very much.